योऽन्तः प्रविश्य मम वाचमिमां प्रसुप्तां सञ्जीवयत्यखिलशक्तिधरस्वधाम्ना अन्यांश्च हस्तचरणश्रवणत्वगादीन् प्राणान् नमो भगवते पुरुषाय तुभ्यम्. Namaskara. The Vedas have both statements that uphold Bheda as well as Abheda. Thus there arises the question, how should we interpret the Vedas? Do the Vedas support Bheda, which is the difference between Brahma and Jiva, or do the Vedas support Abheda, which says that Brahma and Jiva are one and the same? This video is an exploration of the different ideas that attempted to answer this question. First, let's look at some of these statements. There are statements that support Abheda, like Aham Brahmasmi, which basically says I am Brahma. Tattvamasi, that or Brahma is you. Sarvam Khalu Idam Brahma, all this is Brahma. These statements seem to support that Jiva and Brahma are one and the same, or the concept of Abheda. There are also statements in Vedas that support the concept of Bheda. If we look at some of them, there is Nityo Nityanam, which says that Brahma is supreme among all eternals, indicating that Brahma is different from all the eternal Jivas. There are also statements like Dva Suparna Sayuja, which clearly indicates that Jiva and Bhagavanta are two birds that reside in the same tree. Here the tree refers to the body. There are also statements like Prithak Atmanam Preritaram and others, which support the concept of Bheda. So it seems like there are contradictions in Vedas, with some statements supporting Abheda while other statements supporting Bheda. So how do we make sense of Vedas is the primary question. But before we delve into exploring the answers here, there are some disclaimers. First of all, the ideas of Bheda and Abheda are older than Matacharyas. Matacharyas like Shankaracharya, Ramanujacharya, Madhvacharya are what come to mind when we talk about Bheda and Abheda. But these concepts were not the inventions of these Matacharyas. These discussions about Vedas supporting Bheda or Abheda were happening much before the Matacharyas came around. The concept of Bheda also existed before them, and the concept of Abheda also existed before them. But the Matacharyas each gave support for one of the concepts and showed how to interpret the Vedas in order to make sense and support their concept. The second point to note is that there are numerous Vedic topics, and the concept of Bheda and Abheda is just a subsection of all the Vedic topics. Even inside the Matatrayas, or the philosophies of the Matacharyas, there are numerous different concepts that they tend to disagree on. The concept of Bheda-Abheda is just one of them. Now finally, before we enter the topic, we need to understand the foundation for all the concepts that we are going to look at. The first foundation is that we have to agree that Vedas are the truth. Whether Vedas are the ultimate truth or not is a discussion in itself, and it can be explored separately. But to understand what is the true meaning of the Vedas, we need to first accept the foundation that Vedas are the truth. All the Matacharyas have based their concepts on the idea that Vedas are the ultimate truth. The second foundation that we need to accept is that Veda Vyasa's words are true. Veda Vyasa has authored the Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita within it, the Puranas, primarily Bhagavata Purana, and the Brahma Sutras. We need to accept that these are true before we step into the different ideas. Having now accepted the foundation, let's step into the first idea. The first idea is that of Abheda. There is an Acharya who is going to appear here on the left. The Acharya on the left is arguing for the idea, and the Acharya on the right is arguing against the idea. For example, the idea being discussed in this slide, as shown on the top, is the idea of Abheda. The Acharya on the left argues for Abheda, and the Acharya who will appear on the right will argue against Abheda. This format is consistent across all the future slides. So this Acharya arguing for Abheda says that Vedas say Aham Brahmasmi, Vedas say Tattvamasi, and Sarvam Khalu Idam Brahma. Therefore, Vedas only support Abheda. Then the opposition Acharya, who appears here on the right, says, how do you explain Dva Suparna Sayuja, Nityo Nityanam, Prithak Atmanam? These statements also appear in the Veda and seem to support the idea of Bheda or difference. The first Acharya then says that the Vedas do have statements like Dva Suparna, Nityo Nityanam and Prithak Atmanam which seem to support Bheda. But the statements like Aham Brahmasmi, Tattvamasi, Sarvam Khalu Idam Brahma, these are the only statements of the Vedas that are talking about the real truth. Well then, are the statements like Dva Suparna not the truth? Are they false? The Acharya on the left says no, they are not false, but they are not the real truth. So then this Acharya says that there are two types of truth. The real truth and the practical truth. The real truth is called Paramarthika Satya, whereas the practical truth is called Vyavaharika Satya. Vyavaharika Satya just seems like the truth in your current state, but when you have realization of what is really true, it becomes obvious that Vyavaharika Satya is actually false. An example here is that I could say that the sun seems as big as a fruit. This is not false when seen from the perspective of earth, but it's just practical truth. The real truth is that the sun is vast and much bigger than the earth itself. Therefore, Paramarthika Satya is the real state of events, Vastusthiti, whereas Vyavaharika Satya is what might seem to be the truth but is not really the truth. So the Acharya is arguing that statements from the Veda like Aham Brahmasmi, Tattvamasi, Sarvam Khalvidam Brahma all propagate the real truth, the real state of events. Therefore, they are Paramarthika Satya. But statements like Dvasuparna, Nityo Nityanam, Prathakatmanam are really false, but they seem to be true when one is in this illusion of samsara. They are just Vyavaharika Satya. Therefore, Vedas, which do not lie, can be split into real truths and practical truths. This is the idea of the Acharya who argues for the idea of Abheda. The opposition then says, this term called Vyavaharika Satya or practical truth is nothing but a word for a lie. Just because you use a very fancy term called Vyavaharika Satya and covering the word lie with a facade doesn't change your opinion. What you really want to say is that Dvasuparna and all these statements that propagate Bheda are really lies. An ancient Mimamsa scholar by the name of Kumarila Bhatta describes this with an example. He says that the saliva that appears in the mouth is described by ancient poets as Adhara Sudha or Adharamrita, the nectar of the lips or the honey from the lips. But just because they call it honey or nectar doesn't change the real state of events. Saliva is still saliva. Similarly, just covering up your argument with the word Vyavaharika Satya doesn't change the fact that your real argument is that the Vedas are actually lying. But since you do not want to say that the Vedas lie, you're using a fancy word Vyavaharika Satya. But the foundation that has already been accepted is that Vedas cannot lie. Therefore, your argument is not correct. So the opposition rejected the argument of Abheda. Let's look at the next idea here. The next idea is that of Bheda-Abheda. This Acharya on the left is a proponent of Veda-Abheda. Veda-Abheda is the concept that both Bheda and Abheda are true and Vedas support both. The opposition asks how is it possible that both Bheda and Abheda can be true at the same time. To this the Acharya replies that this is not a matter for me to understand. I just accept the words of the Vedas as it is. I am not going to use logical gymnastics to understand the words of the Vedas but just accept it. The opposition says that this is just blind faith. You're offering no answers, you're not attempting to understand it but just accepting the words plainly. Therefore, this argument fails too. The third argument is that of Bheda-Abheda with explanation. The Acharya who argues for this says that both Bheda and Abheda are true and Vedas support both, but we will explain it with an example. The opposition asks for more explanation, which the Acharya provides in the next slide. Taking the example of some mud which can be transformed into a pot. A potter can use a wheel to transform this mud into a pot. So is there difference or non-difference between the pot and the mud? The mud itself is not the pot. There is a lot more mud in the world. Just a small section of that mud has been taken and transformed into a pot. Therefore, mud is not pot. But pot really is just mud. The pot is just mud that has been hardened. All parts of the pot is just hardened mud. Therefore, the mud is not pot. Therefore, there is Bheda. But the pot is just mud. This is Abheda. Therefore, we see both Bheda and Abheda when talking about mud and pot. If we replace the mud with Brahma here, and we replace the pot with the Jiva, then we see both Bheda and Abheda between Brahma and Jiva. But to do this, we need to accept a similar relationship that we saw between the mud and the pot. Since the mud transforms into the pot, here we need to accept that Brahma transforms into the Jiva. If Brahma transforms into the Jiva, then we can accept that Brahma is not Jiva, Bheda, and Jiva is Brahma itself, Abheda. Therefore, the Acharya on the left has shown that there is both Bheda and Abheda existing between Brahma and Jiva. Because Brahma is different from Jiva, but Jiva is not different from Bhagavanta or Brahma. This can happen when Brahma transforms into Jiva. This was an excellent argument, but the opposition points out that there are still some issues with this argument. The Acharya on the left claimed that Bhagavanta transforms into the Jiva, but the Vedas claim that Bhagavanta or Brahma is Nirvikara, which means he has no transformations. He is constant and always unchanging. How then can Brahma transform into a Jiva? The Acharya has no answer to this. The opposition also points out another issue with this idea. The proponent of the idea claimed that Bhagavanta transformed into a Jiva. But why would Bhagavanta transform into a Jiva? If he was forced to do so, then how can he be Bhagavanta? One of the primary qualities of Bhagavanta is that he is independent and not under anyone's control. Therefore, he cannot be forced or cursed into transforming into a Jiva. Okay, so let's say that Bhagavanta transformed into a Jiva through his own free will. But why would he do that? Bhagavanta, who is independent, omnipresent, omniscient, filled with all great gunas, would never want to transform into an inferior Jiva who is neither omnipresent, neither omniscient and filled with so many flaws. Why would Bhagavanta want to downgrade to a Jiva? There is no reason for this and it makes no sense. Therefore, this idea of Bheda-Abheda with explanation also has several holes. Let's explore the final idea, which is that of Bheda. The Acharya on the left here again is arguing for Bheda. This Acharya says that Vedas support only Bheda. There are no statements in the Vedas that claim Abheda. As you might expect, the opposition points out Aham Brahmasmi, Tattvamasi, Sarvam Khalvidam Brahma are all statements that support the concept of Abheda. How do you explain them? The Acharya on the left says that what about those statements? They seem to be indicating Bheda as well. I don't see them talking about Abheda at all. This seems very confusing, but the Acharya explains it with a few examples in the next slide. Let's take Aham Brahmasmi for example. Aham Brahmasmi. The literal meaning of Aham Brahmasmi seems to be I am Brahma, indicating that the Jiva is Bhagavanta himself. But you could interpret Aham Brahmasmi in several different ways. Let's look at the first interpretation using just words. Aham Brahma Asmi. I am Brahma. But Aham doesn't have to mean I. The literal meaning of Aham is the one who no one can live without. Aham is generally interpreted as I because I cannot live without myself. Therefore, I am Aham for myself. But Aham really means the one no one can live without. This is really a name of Brahma or Bhagavanta because no one can live without Bhagavanta within them. Therefore, Aham Brahmasmi then translates to the one who no one can live without is Brahma. When looking at it from this lens, it does not seem to propagate Abheda at all. The second interpretation is a context-based interpretation. Where does Aham Brahmasmi appear in the Vedas? The statement where it appears is Brahma va idamagramasid tadatmanam eva ved aham brahmasmi iti. It says, in the beginning, Brahma was alone. He knew that Aham Brahmasmi or that I am Brahma. Looking at the context, this statement is used from the perspective of Bhagavanta and not from the perspective of the Jiva. It says that Bhagavanta, when he was alone, knew that he is Brahma. So the Acharya says, why then should we take it out of the context and interpret it to apply to the Jiva? It is not the Jiva who says Aham Brahmasmi in the Veda, but it is Bhagavanta himself. Thus, even if you are interpreting Aham as I, then it should apply to Bhagavanta and not to the Jiva. Let us look at another statement here called Tattvamasi. If looking at the word-based interpretation, the Vedas says Sa Atma Tattvamasi, which is generally split as Sa Atma Tattvamasi. He is Atma, that is you. It seems to suggest that Atma or Bhagavanta is you, which is the Jiva. However, while splitting this, it can be split into Atattvamasi, or that is not you. So it says Sa Atma Atattvamasi. He is Atma, that is not you. But why should I split it this way? Why not split it as Tattvamasi and claim that Abheda is true? Well, you can look at the context-based interpretation to understand that. The context where it appears in the Vedas is that a father is lecturing his son about his arrogance. It is a conversation between the father Uddalaka and the son Shvetaketu. The son returns from school having performed extremely well and is filled with arrogance that there is no one who has more knowledge than him. He doesn't touch his father's feet upon returning home. The father, who is upset about the arrogance of his son, starts lecturing him that he knows nothing about Bhagavanta, the Bhagavanta who is everywhere, who is omnipresent, who is omniscient, who is within all. And then he says Tattvamasi. While lecturing his son about arrogance, why would he say that Bhagavanta is everywhere and you are that Bhagavanta? Wouldn't that just increase his arrogance? It makes more sense to split it as Atattvamasi so that the lecture of the father makes sense. He is really saying that you don't know anything about the Bhagavanta who is everywhere, who is omniscient, who is within you. You are not that Bhagavanta yourself. Don't be so arrogant. So in this way, the Acharya on the left can explain all statements in Vedas to fit the idea of Bheda. Therefore, he claims that all statements of Vedas fit the idea of Bheda and nothing really propagates Abheda. The opposition then thinks about it and comes up with another argument. So if we can interpret the Vedas in a way to fit Bheda, so why not do the same for Abheda? Let us split the Bheda statements wherever we want, look at the context in detail, twist it a bit, and say that everything applies to Abheda as well. He says we'll let go of the idea of Paramarthika Satya and Vyavaharika Satya, claim that everything is Paramarthika Satya, but interpret it in a different way so that everything supports the idea of Abheda, just like the Bheda Acharya did with the idea of Bheda. To that, the Acharya who supports Bheda says, remind me what your foundation was. There was a foundation slide in the beginning which said that the foundation is that the Vedas speak the truth and Veda Vyasa's words are the truth. Here we are trying to identify what the truth of the Vedas is. And now we have reached the idea that Vedas can be split in a way to interpret it both to fit the idea of Bheda as well as to fit the idea of Abheda, but we want to identify which path should we take. Therefore, let's look at the second foundation. What does Veda Vyasa say in his Granthas? Veda Vyasa, who has written Mahabharata, Puranas and Brahma Sutra, has stated at several occasions the idea of Bheda. For example, in Bhagavad Gita, in the 15th chapter, Krishna says, Uttamah Purushastvanyaha Paramatyet Yudahrataha. He claims that there are different sections of Purushas. There is Kshara Purusha, there is Akshara Purusha, but above all and superior to all, there is Uttama Purusha, and I am the Uttama Purusha, clearly stating the difference between the Jiva and Brahma. In the 11th skanda of Bhagavata, Uddhava directly asks Krishna if Jiva and Bhagavanta are one or different. Krishna clearly states Suparnavetau Sadrishau Sakhayo, which is a shloka that has the same meaning as Dva Suparna Sayuja Sakhaya, two birds in the same tree, representing Bhagavanta and the Jiva, which he claims to be different. Also at the end of Mahabharata, Yudhishthira asks Bhishma if all beings are the same or different, to which Bhishma says, Naita Dichanti Purusham Ekam Kurukulodhava. Learned ones do not consider all beings being the same. So as shown here and in several other places, Veda Vyasa has indicated that Jiva and Bhagavanta are really different, upholding the concept of Bheda. This concept of Bheda was propagated by Madhvacharya. Madhvacharya wrote a stotra called Kurubhungshvacha Karma Nijam Niyatam. In the 7th verse of that stotra, he says, Vyavahara bhidapi guror jagatam natu chittagata sahi chodya param. Bhavah Purusha Purusha Pravaro Hariritya Vadat Swayameva Hari. This verse is a beautiful summary of the entire argument that we saw here. He says that this idea of Vyavaharika Satya that we saw to reconcile Abheda is not aligned with the teachings or opinions of the Guru of the world, in this case Veda Vyasa. Because Veda Vyasa in his scriptures asked the question himself, are there many beings or is everyone the same? He asked this question from the perspective of Arjuna or Uddhava or Yudhishthira, as we just saw. Sahichodya Param, meaning he asked this question in his scriptures himself. And he answered it as Bhavah Purushaha. There are many beings. Purusha Pravaro Harihi. Among all the beings, the greatest is Hari. Iti Avadat Swayameva Harihi. The answer to this was given by Hari himself. Krishna himself answered this to Arjuna. Krishna himself answered Uddhava. And Veda Vyasa himself, who is an avatara of Bhagavanta according to Madhvacharya, has composed these answers in his scriptures himself. Therefore, Hari himself asked the question and Hari himself gave the answer. Therefore, the concept of Vyavaharika Satya and Paramarthika Satya to support Abheda is not the right argument, and the concept of Bheda, upheld by Veda Vyasa in his scriptures, is the one that Vedas should be interpreted to support. This is the idea of Madhvacharya's interpretation of the Vedas. Some final thoughts here. First one is that this presentation has been from a Madhva's perspective. It ended with Madhvacharya's perspective as the final argument, but there can be many counter arguments here as well. That is the nature of logic. Any philosophical argument can be countered with logic, and any philosophical argument can be proved with logic. But the final truth is that logic will not lead to any answers. It may help convince individuals of what might be the truth and what the path they want to follow should be. But the real truth must be tested and experienced. Therefore, one must just use logic to understand what path he might want to take. But to realize if that is the truth or not, experience is the one and only way. At this point, I'll end this topic. Shri Krishnarpanamastu.